There's been a lot of talk, understandably so, about China and China's role in the coronavirus. That is to say, at the minimum, not warning the world about what was to come and the human to human transmissibility of this virus. But have they also been trying to hide the reality of how this was developed? Was it in the Wuhan virology lab, for example? We know it started in Wuhan. There have been a lot of reports about this. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and President Trump both have said that there is significant amount of evidence for this. We have talked about it on the program before, particularly with our next guest, Bazzel Baz, who is a former CIA officer, also retired Marine, and the founder of the Association of Recovery of Children, which literally in the dark of night will rescue children without their captors knowing, who have been trafficked. It's wonderful work. And of course, he's also a former, maybe future, star on the Blacklist. Bazzel Baz rejoins us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Baz, my friend, welcome back.
Morning, Jimmy. How are you?
You know, I'm doing all right. It's so good to see you and talk with you again. I appreciate you joining us. You were the first one, I think you were the first one that I hadn't even seen an article yet, who told me a little bit that you were hearing some things maybe about this virology lab. What do you think we know about this? Because there is some discussion. Is it where this started or not?
Well, I think that the probably NSA, the agency, and a number of other agencies that are responsible for gathering the required intelligence for the president to make policy changes or decisions regarding this is probably pretty solid. Particularly with some of the statements that the president's making already. He's probably already read the papers, the intel reports. I think that the it's not a matter, Jimmy, of whether it was done at that lab or the lab down the street. What we do know is for the fact that this was worked up in China itself. We also know enough about China over the years to know that it is virtually impossible for anything of this nature to have been developed without the oversight of the government. And the distribution of this, whether we want to call it an attack or a leak or an or a mishap or whatever you want to call it, was not done or did not occur without the government knowing it. I see the kind of the language now is kind of leaning towards, at least in some of the more liberal media platforms, that maybe they're just guilty of just not telling us. Maybe it slipped and something went wrong and they were embarrassed and they just don't they just didn't know what to do.
Sure.
That's not the case.
I want to play cut 7 here. This is a snippet of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo yesterday, who had a press event where he talked with the press about China a good bit in this conversation.
China could have spared the world descent into global economic malaise. They had a choice, but instead, China covered up the outbreak in Wuhan. Its National Health Commission ordered virus samples destroyed on January 3rd. China disappeared brave Chinese citizens who raised alarms. It deployed its propaganda organs to denounce those who politely called for simple transparency. And that brings us to today, 120 days on. China is still refusing to share the information we need to keep people safe.
Bazzel Baz, the big question is, why isn't China providing additional information? And some would say that maybe it's because they have something very specific to hide, which is that this was indeed originated in some fashion from a lab in China, and they don't want us to be able to definitively prove it.
You know, based on my experience, when I start hearing things like this, what we start wondering is that exactly that, Jimmy. What else is there at that lab or other labs or labs we're not aware of that have other dangerous viruses or other things that they probably should not have been working on. We have to remember something is that China isn't interested in being anyone's partner economically, financially, on the military front. They are interested in dominating the United States, dominating the world. And so, when in order for you, if you're transparent, if you say, "Hey, we made a mistake," then what that generally requires is people like the U.S. or other countries being allowed to come in your country to say, "Look, then let us get in there to figure out how you made that mistake. How did it slip through the cracks? We want to make sure it never happens again." And then that's when we start discovering other things. And I am pretty certain that the Chinese probably don't want us in there, knowing what else they have been working on.
Former CIA officer Bazzel Baz joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Let's do this, because there's been a lot of discussion in the media trying to discredit this idea. And one of the people that they're pointing to is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Esper. I want to play cut 8 first, and then we'll do cut 9, which is a clip from CNN discussing what Esper had to say. So here's the general.
Is it natural, or was it man-made somehow, or somehow manipulated by man-made procedures? As I said the last time, and I am still where I was the last time, the weight of evidence, nothing's conclusive. The weight of evidence is that it was natural and not man-made. Secondly, the second issue is, was it accidentally released? Did it release naturally into the environment, or was it intentional? We don't have conclusive evidence in any of that, but the weight of evidence is that it was probably not intentional. The third issue is location. Did it come out of the virology lab in Wuhan? Did it occur in the wet market there in Wuhan? Did it occur somewhere else? And the answer to that is we don't know. And as mentioned by many people, various agencies, both civilian and U.S. government, are looking at that. It would help a great deal if the Chinese government would open up and allow inspectors and investigators to go there in full transparency, so that the world can know the actual original source of this, so that we can apply the lessons learned and prevent outbreaks in the future.
Just a quick correction. That's actually General Mark Milley. Esper is the defense secretary. So let's play cut 9 now and then get your reaction. This is a clip from CNN after they had played some of what the general said.
Well, Dr. Fauci now weighing in, Jake, saying that from everything that he's seen of the evolution of this virus, that it moved naturally from an animal to a human. And Jake, that part, that this is not man-made, is pretty much universally accepted. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence is on the record saying as much. Where the divisions start is where exactly the virus originated in Wuhan, whether it started in that market or was an accidental release from the lab. Dr. Fauci is saying that regardless, it started in nature. And what you're hearing from members of the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, they're pushing this theory that it was accidentally released from a lab. Now you have the U.S. intelligence community, which generally doesn't say anything in public unless they have an assessment, coming out saying they're looking into both those theories, the market and the lab. And in fact, they say that they have evidence of both. The only thing that they're saying with certainty is that it came from China and that it's not man-made. But in seeing the Trump administration pushing this theory that it was accidentally released from a lab, the U.S. finds itself increasingly in isolation, at odds with its intelligence partners. I was speaking with a Western diplomatic official who has seen the intelligence, who says that it's highly likely that the virus was not an accidental release. This is, according to this official, the growing consensus of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing partnership that includes Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And so what you're seeing is this group of nations essentially saying that what they're seeing is an assessment. It's not 100%, but what they believe is that the virus occurred in nature and came out of this lab. But Jake, what everyone came out of the market.
Bazzel Baz, so I threw a lot of sound at you. Please go ahead and tell us your former intelligence officer opinion on this.
Look, a lot of people on there are dancing with their words, okay? So let's say it, quote unquote, started in nature. In other words, we found it in nature. It still went to a lab. So if you're not listening to if you're not really listening to what they're not saying, and you're just paying attention to what they are saying, you're like, oh my gosh, well, they're off the hook because, look, it started in the wet market. Okay. Let's say we found it in the wet market. then why did it end up in a lab? And what happened to it when it ended up in a lab? And why was it in the lab? And what were they doing with it in the lab, like everything else? And did they take it there and did they re-engineer it? Did they do something different with it? Was it, tag and tailed with the H1N influenza vaccine that they gave a lot of people in Italy at one time, making them more susceptible to this virus or this new virus, So we have to, I think if you listen to the end of what you just heard in CNN, there's a lot of evidence that leads us to believe that something, let's just say that, something took place in this lab and created something that's doing a lot of damage and killing people. And now the question is, was it released intentionally or was it not released intentionally? And there is more and more intelligence coming out that it was in fact a direct attack or launched intentionally against the world, so to speak. We have even now, after being out of the agency, we still keep some pretty strong connections with the intel community and almost kind of like a civilian intel community among a lot of different players throughout the world, politicians, scientists, doctors, the average guy on the street. And if you're really paying attention to what's been happening prior to all of this, it appears that there are a lot of other people at some very big levels, FDA, AMA, scientific communities, that all kind of knew about this process happening way ahead of time. And there are just some things that just appear to be just way too convenient. Things people said a year previous, or people being involved in this process that aren't even scientists. Look, I don't
What do you
mind
mean
saying
by
it.
that? What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, Bill Gates. Bill Gates isn't a scientist. Bill Gates isn't a doctor. Why is Bill Gates now all of a sudden the authority on a vaccine for the coronavirus? I mean, these things are still in question. Look, there's still some questions about Fauci making statements prior to this that there is a pandemic coming. There are still some questions about Fauci dealing with China when there was a moratorium on dealing with China. So there's a lot of interesting questions that need to be answered. What if you start taking a look at the ties in with people like Fauci and his colleagues and the FDA or the AMA, and why things like hydroxychloroquine that all of a sudden seem to work on a lot of people, but the FDA is saying, well, there's not enough testing on it, but yet you've got people that are being cured of something. Or here's one yesterday. This blows my mind. The FDA now went after a company, and I know a company that developed chlorine dioxide. Now, chlorine dioxide has been used as a water purification element for years. I mean, there are many of us that have used it across the board in the jungles of Africa and South America to kill viruses, anti-malarial, whatever it may be. And there are companies that produce this as water purification. In fact, there was a time, and there are some government studies that show that chlorine dioxide actually kills pathogens. Yet that's never being mentioned. Or all of a sudden it's getting notoriety and people are getting better. And yet the FDA now is starting to attack those companies that are creating chlorine dioxide.
Well, I have to say,
there's these little things, like
Sure.
this, when they're happening, and they go, well, there are not enough studies, but yet you've got 20,000 people that are taking something and they're killing off the virus. The question is, why don't you look at it? Well, maybe because there's not billions of dollars, or maybe big pharmaceutical companies got their hand in it. It's a lot of things. People learned in the intel community. Money is a very important thing to a lot of people.
Well, one thing in my mind is that this just a whole thing underscores. Last Friday, we spent the whole day talking about the whole show on Free to Choose Friday, talking about getting the FDA off the backs of innovation when it comes to prescription drugs and doctors being able to prescribe it to patients. In other words, limit the role of the FDA so you don't have these situations where maybe some companies are trying to block the introduction of certain medications, or the FDA deciding they don't want this or that to be done because they have their hands all over the approval process. But then also you have this supposed whistleblower now who's saying, oh, he wasn't part of the Trump administration wanting to push hydroxychloroquine, which is unproven, and the media is hyping that up. So it does raise a whole slew of questions, but I want to get back to China here with you in our last few minutes, sure. Bazzel Baz. That is, the Wall Street Journal has an editorial today calling on the Trump administration, if they have this evidence that suggests this may be the case, to release said evidence. What do you think about the idea of Trump, Pompeo, General Milley, any of these folks actually saying, here's what we have that suggests that China may have done this, versus just saying it out loud?
Well, I think that as you collect the intel, Jimmy, one of the things you have to pay close attention to is the strategy that you're going to apply to either negotiate with China or shut China down or retaliate against China, or put yourself, the United States, in a better position so this never happens again. And that sometimes can be a kind of a slow process, and it's a very sensitive process to begin with. So as you know, the President of the United States and this administration have been under attack by not only the Democrats, but the liberal community, the socialists, globalists, whatever it may be, that exist here in America. So I think that they're just being careful of what they release and how they release it and the timing of it, because quite honestly, they have their hands full right now. And I don't blame them for that. It's not that the American people won't know, but sometimes you have intelligence gathering is ongoing. And until you've collected all the information that you need to make a proper assessment, you just can't release that in bits and pieces to the American public.
Why have they been talking about this and saying, oh, we have evidence, while not releasing evidence?
Well, I think they want to comfort America. I think they want to make sure that America understands that, definitely, guess what? Sure. We were attacked. We didn't do this to ourselves. And so we want China to know that we know, and that we're never going to let it happen again. But the specific information, the people behind it, how it was released, whoever, that'll eventually come, I'm pretty sure. But it has to be done at the right time.
It's interesting. So let's do the... Sure. Well, we're running out of time here, Bazzel Baz, but let's do the final question that I always like to ask you as someone who is an alum from the Blacklist, which is, of course, one of my favorite television shows. Paint a picture, this scenario, what you're describing, and how it might play out in an episode of The Blacklist starring James Spader.
Oh, my gosh. James Spader and Baz go to the White House. The president, in a secret meeting, says, all negotiations are off the table with China. We don't know what to do. I'm surrounded by the cabal. I'm even finding that some of the closest medical people to my organization, some of the greatest and most powerful technology leaders in the United States, are all part of the cabal. I don't know what to do. And so James Spader says, Baz, we're taking a trip. So Spader and Baz, what they do is they simultaneously put a plan into motion where they literally kidnap 20 of the top most powerful globalists that they know were a part of this virus thing. And they put them in a shipping container on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And then Baz takes his team in, and they go into the Wuhan lab. Of course, there's a lot of shooting, a lot of bad guys get killed, of course. And they not only discover that the Wuhan virus was in fact there, but they discovered 5 other viruses that the Chinese had been working on. So they steal all of those and they destroy the lab. They come back and they put them in the shipping container, and they're all, of course, in vials, of course, little tubes. And the 20 great, most powerful cabal leaders are there, and they say, here's the deal. We owe this much money to the Chinese, our debt. You all are going to pay us all of this money, or we're going to break all of these vials, and you're all going to die in this container here. And then we're going to drop you in the ocean and sink you to the bottom, and no one will ever know. So the 20 cabal leaders, what do? They all take all of their money. We take all of their money out of their accounts, and we secretly transfer it to 5 different banks, and the money mysteriously ends up in the U.S. Treasury. But we've already had a talk with the U.S. Treasury that every American in the United States of America, that's a legal American, of course, will receive a portion of all of that money.
That is
Save America.
this is the third time we've had you on and that I've asked you for a scenario, and that is the single most elaborate that you've come up with. And you know what? I could absolutely see that happening in an episode of The Blacklist. Baz, always great to talk with you, my friend. Fascinating perspective, former intelligence operative. Thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
You're welcome, Jimmy. Thank you very much. You guys have a great day.
Stay well, be healthy. Once again, Baz joining us. Bazzel Baz joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.